All right, let's talk about some gauges here. Gauges are good, they're on pins. If you don't have gauge, you ever drove a car that gauges weren't working on it? Like if your pedometer's not working, you're in pretty bad shape. Boyce Motometer with a little alcohol-based thermometer used to go on the top of the radiator back in the day. And that was the first time anybody even tried to put any kind of a gauge on a car, as far as I know. And it came out in 1912 and was used in automobiles to read the temperature of the radiator, and which was kind of interesting how they did that back then. You see how that thing didn't have a thermostat, didn't have a water pump? It would just percolate that water up like a coffee pot, and it would go in here and go down through the radiator, and then it would come back in there, and it was constantly circulating like that. But this one on top of the radiator cap, you drive down the road, you can see it out there through the hood. The gas tank on these cars was right in front of the windshield, and it was gravity fed down to the carburetor. And if you were really low on gas and you started up a hill, the gas, the carburetor would go dry, you had to try and you had to back up the hill. Is that how you do on that? That was back in the day.
You know about them days, didn't you?
Well, I knew about them. I never had to do that, but I knew about them. The Dodge Brothers dashboard started looking a little bit more like some of the old, the Stuart Warner gauges you could buy and all that kind of stuff. That's pretty cool stuff right there. And bimetal gauges until the late 70s.
You skipped the page.
Actually were, they pretty much had disappeared on a lot of cars by the early 70s, but some vehicles held on to them until the late 70s. And you had a little wire that was wrapped around this bimetal strip, and bimetal strip is basically two kinds of metal that are married together. When it heats up, it changes shape. That's kind of like what's in one of the old AC thermostats. You'd have a spiral spring in there, and whenever the temperature changes, that spring changes its shape, and it always goes back and forth. That's a really good memory. That right there is a instrument voltage regulator that was wired in with this thing, and so that when you ground one side of that gauge, the ground would be increased as the gauge, as the descending unit grounded that gauge, and this would change shape and it would cause that needle to go over. But that instrument voltage regulator only put out like 5 volts, and it was a pulsing signal. But the gauge you didn't usually see it moving. I used to take a test light, hook it up to the gauge wire, and see if it was blinking like that. That way I would know I had a good instrument voltage regulator. All right, and so the bimetal gauges, this is kind of how it's wired up. You can see that. And once again, there's that bimetal gauge there, their sender. They work different ways, but pretty much they're all wired the same way. It just depends on what words were on the gauge. It's what you were reading and what it was wired to. All right, so on bimetal gauges, grounding the sender would drive the temp and fuel gauges high. Now the alternator was a different kind of gauge. I'll talk about that in a minute. Typically, the instrument voltage regulator will generally flash the light, and the gauge will respond by sweeping up. These gauges gave the same information, but in the 70s, some of the cars started having these sexy instrument clusters, that kind of got, it kind of went away after a while.
And then it came back.
And we'll turn that off because it's getting hot in here. All right. Except I think I got the fan running all the time. Anyway, the long and short of it is always check your schematic to make sure you know what's going on before you dig into one of these things. And this is a backlit display. Now, have you ever seen a cluster like that? You ever seen one look like that? That was an 84
turbo.
That was an 84 Thunderbird. Is what it was. You see a check turbo over there. That's a Thunderbird Turbo Coupe. All right. So be careful with the old one. This old Jeep right here. I was working on one of these one time, and I made a mistake of switching the key on when I was working on that early 80s Grand Wagoneer, and I had the cluster unmounted out of the dash, and I watched all of the gauges go all the way to the top, and it burned out the little wires in them. But it's because the cluster wasn't grounded. Usually the cluster had a separate ground wire feeding it, but these were grounded where they were mounted and all that. That stupid air conditioner drives me up the wall. Look there, I got it turned off and it's still running. See, I got the system turned off, the fan just keeps on running.
And click off.
Yeah, Joey, you probably need to hit it with his fist or something. When he comes over here. All right, speedometers, this is kind of funny here. See that little needle that was riding in there? It would spin that little drum, that magnetic, there's a little magnet that spins inside that drum, and it would drive that needle against the spring. And that base of that needle would sit down in this little socket that was in the part that this cable would spin. And on some of those Tauruses, that thing would start to grab the needle shaft and it would start bouncing the needle around all over the place. And a speedometer cost several $100s for one of those. And one day I says, look, the lady was saying, I don't have to spend $400 or $500 for it. So I tell you what, I'm gonna charge you $25 to try something. If it don't work, I don't wanna hear you fussing about it. She says, okay, whatever you can try for $25, it might keep my speedometer needle from bouncing all over the place. So I took the speedometer apart, which I kind of knew how to do that. There ain't nothing in the book to tell you how to do that. You just gotta figure it out.
You do an extra one, set the miles back about a couple thousand.
Well, that's $1 million fine from the federal government. It really is. I ain't kidding. If it's bad
What?
to do that, yeah, I say $1 million fine. They'll bust you wide open for doing that. That's, you know, that's federal. That's a felony. So don't even think about it.
Well, if you rebuild
But, I got time.
well, if you rebuild it,
You rebuild it, you put the miles back where they were, or you go to jail. You do not roll the miles back on the speedometer. Bad, Charles. All right, now, that's pirating. All right, now, right now, I put a little drop of oil in there where that needle shaft went. I blew it out, and I put a little drop of oil in there, and it was swimming in oil. Now, you had to know how to put the needle back on there so it was pointing the right way, but I fixed a lot of these things like that. And take them apart, I kind of enjoyed it. Now, when we replaced the speedometer, if you replace the speedometer, have one of these kind of wheels in there, it'd have a red number on it. And when you see that red number on there, if the salesman saw the red number when you're trading your car in, it immediately bumped you about 25% in your trade-in value because the speedometer had been changed. But you're supposed to put a sticker on the door saying the speedometer had been changed at this mileage, and so they could calculate the miles. But what I always did was I took the drum with all those miles on it out of the speedometer I was taking out of the car, and I would put it in the other one so they have exactly the same miles. That way I wouldn't go to jail. Okay? All right then. Now, fuel gauges. You got a variable resistor here. And on those Chevrolets, these things like to wear out, and the gauge goes wacky all over the place. There's a little resistor right there. You can see it. You've seen those if you've changed out a fuel pump. And this is here, and that's there, and then there's your float. And as that float comes up, you know, most of the time when you touch the wires together that are going to that gas gauge, what does the gauge do?
Hey, what?
It goes to empty when you touch them together. When you open them up, it goes to full. Remember that. You're going to have to troubleshoot a gas gauge this afternoon.
How do you?
I'll call Will and make sure.
What's wrong with
What?
a fuel sending unit if it's about eighth of the tank off?
Eighth of a tank off is not so bad, but you can bend your little arm in there and fix that, if you know which way to bend it. Later model vehicles with hardwired clusters would incorporate an anti-slosh module. I was riding with Gundy Roberts, and we were all in the car with him, and I was sitting kind of behind him where I could see his gas gauge on this side of his 72 Oldsmobile. And he's had his arm around his girlfriend, he's driving along here. And so he's coming up behind his car, and he wants to pass her, and she's sort of wimpy, and she didn't want him to pass him. So he looks at her, and she goes, and he punches it, and it throws us all back in the seat like we're making a jump to light speed. But I watched the gas gauge went click, because it sloshed all the way back to empty. And whenever he got around the car and he let off, it went back up, but not quite as far. This is a true story. I was sitting there. Okay, but the later model cars put an anti-slosh module in between the gas gauge sender and the fuel level. And it also would turn on a little fuel indicator if you got below a certain level, but the anti-slosh module was to keep it from correcting too quickly. So if you're checking one of those and you short the wires together to see if it's going to go to empty, or you take them off, you have to switch the key off and turn it back on so it'll correct quickly, which it will do that. Yeah, what you got there? That is, oh yeah, that's mine. Oh golly, I gotta give you some money though. All right, hold on. All right, just keep it changing value of soda pop. All right, there you go. Now, speedometer cables have been known for a long time. Most clusters have needles, even, you know, but they're not driven by one of these anymore. We used to have to pull that thing out of there. I'd pull the instrument cluster out, and I would pull the center of that thing out, and I would pack some grease around it and put it back down in there to keep it from going click, 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 and make noises, you know, rather than replacing the cable, which was a pain a lot of the time. I just grease the center of it, put it back in there, and it'd be just fine. And that was just one of them things where cables were a thing. So speedometers, these days, some kind of speed sensor is going to be sending a signal either directly to the cluster or through some module. There's your speed sensor, there's your electronic speedometer. And a lot of these clusters you see laying up there, they've got electronic speedometer. You'll hardly ever see one with a speedometer cable hooked up to it anymore. It's just pretty much gone. Notice on this one right here how nice they are on this 99 Taurus. It says 22 ohms empty, 145 ohms full. You know, so I say you short them together, it goes to empty. Now on a temperature gauge, when you short it to ground, it goes to hot. Remember, the temperature gauge and the fuel gauge work opposite ways. And you got a voltmeter. They started putting voltmeters on cars, and they did away with amp meters in the late 70s to confuse the crap out of everybody that used to see an amp meter. And these speed sensors can be just about anywhere. They can be here or there or here. Every one of these is a vehicle speed sensor of some kind. And so you're just like, you gotta find out where the darn thing is and keep up with that. All right, now find the speedometer in a vehicle speed sensor. That's what I told you right there. You got 10 seconds to do that. Bang, bang, there's the speedometer right there. See the speed sensor? There's the speedometer. You notice the speedometer, what do you see about the speedometer? It's got two fuses feeding it. If either one of those fuses blows, you're probably not going to have any kind of speed indication. All right, now magnetic gauges had two windings in them, and these coils, there's your back of your meter, and the ignition switch would go here, and they would basically align a magnetic field so the needle would go this way and that. The more of a ground you see coming from your whatever your sender is, the more the needle would go in that direction or the other. That's not all that complicated. The interesting thing about these is, they started, first time I saw these was in the early 70s Chevrolets. When you'd switch off the key, wherever the gas gauge was, there it would stay. On the old bimetals, it'd drop back. All right, and so the coil is acting, you know, on a gauge pointer and pull it in opposite directions and all that. I had a worksheet I used to give out where we would hand you a sending unit, a gauge, and let you play with it and watch the needle go back and forth on that. Now modern day clusters have a computer built into the cluster, and that's basically in your DLC. We'll talk to that in a lot of cases. Also on these Chevrolets, and I was going to put a picture of this up there, these mid-2000 Chevrolets that the gauges go crazy on, you can buy a kit online that's got everything you need to replace all the little stepper motors in an instrument cluster on one of these Chevrolet pickups. And it ain't that hard to do if you're hand at soldering. The little kit's like $38, and it comes with a soldering iron, something to pull the needle with. It comes with all the lights that goes in the cluster, and it comes with all the little like 6 or 7 stepper motors in a little box. And you get, and also some solder. It's real handy. Everything you need to rebuild them. We've done that here at 8 Hour to do. All right, so film and RAM. These are forward electronic module and rear electronic module. On the rear electronic module, which is there behind the this thing here, it gets to everything that's on the back of the vehicle that has a wire supposed to be going to it. It's controlled by this. Well, the tank unit goes through this, and then it feeds the signal to the cluster over the network. And if the tank unit dies or quits putting out a reliable signal, the gauge will just keep sending whatever signal was the last good one that it got, which is really kind of crazy, and that could cause you to run out of gas, you know. All right, network-driven clusters are what we've got right now most of the time. Even the messages in here, all these needles are driven by that. And the CPU in the instrument cluster drives all those needles and anything else the cluster needs to do. Now this one right here is kind of what you're looking at here. You see you got a GM LAN low-speed serial data right here. See all them gauges up there? You don't have them hardwired anymore. The information is basically going to come back to the ECM or sometimes to the cluster and all that. On the old, there was even as late as the late 90s, some of the Jeeps had an electronic cluster. And you think that the high beam indicator is actually going to come on whenever it's going to be wired into the high beam lights. So when you turn on the high beam lights, what happens now, or what happens on those and a lot of other cases, it'll actually, the body computer is taking input from the switch, and the body computer turns on the high beam lights by operating a relay, and then it sends a message to the instrument cluster and says, can I please have a high beam indicator? And so it's asking for a high beam indicator, and the cluster's got to basically tell it what it wants to do there. And that's how these right here works. That's a network driven cluster, and that's old. I mean, that's 21 years old now. All right. And see, as I said, 20 years old when I made that. But see, this twisted pair, everything is hooked into them same 2 wires. Well, that bus, a CCD bus, CCD is Chrysler's, what they call Chrysler collision detection. That has nothing to do with having a crash. It has a tendency with keeping the messages from crashing in each other over the network. And so, data link connector, you see, is hooked into them same 2 wires. And those wires are feeding all your modules. They're just a few modules. Now you'll have sometimes 60, 70 computers on a car on various different buses. 2014 Buick Regal. Now that looks like that'd be a complicated wiring schematic, doesn't it? That's 2014 model now. All right, let's have a look at this. Ain't that complicated? Ain't really nothing to it, is there? When you look at that, everything's electronic. You got a fuse or two here and all that, just not much there, as far as you can tell that. All right, so hybrid electronic clusters, actually they prove out whenever you turn them on. And all the needles, you notice how they sweep and they come back so you can make sure they're okay, and then they go to whatever they're reading and all that. All right, so watch out for bulletins, especially when all the gauges have gone dark and fuses are blown. There's sometimes you'll have issues with that. This one guy that I had working at a GM dealership said that he got a pickup in there. That was a, early 2000s or whatever it was, and he said the gauges were all screwed up, and basically all he had to do was do a little reflash with the Tech 2, and he fixed it because he found a TSB. And the guy that was running the dealership says everybody else that gets one of these replaces the cluster. Because they did a bunch of them that come in there like that. He was smart enough to go look up a technical service bulletin, and that was the whole thing. Of course, I taught him to do that, and it worked out that time. Now this one right here, sometimes it'll be, this is another bulletin, if it gets wrapped all the way around to where it's bumping the bottom of the post, there's basically a little procedure you go to, the reset button and all that hogwash to straighten that out. You'll probably never see that, but there it is in case you need to know. Illumination, that's an interesting thing there. Have you ever driven a car that some of the bulbs were burned out where you couldn't see all the gauges? That's annoying as all get out, isn't it?
It was running one bulb, and I got it.
And these are basically, this is a series parallel circuit. They basically, because you got this little rheostat in between there, and it's basically feeding all these other lights. You got the instrument panel, the printed circuit instrument panel, and all the ashtray lights, the heater AC control, he had the radio light and all that. You notice they're being fed by that little thing right there. Through that fuse. The tail lamps fuse is basically going to be feeding that, and then you got an instrument lamp fuse here. Why do they put the tail lamp fuse feeding the instrument lamp fuse?
Because when you turn the tail light on for the running lights, all of them come on.
I know, but why do they wire those two? Why do they wire these in series?
So you know when your tail lights go up.
Exactly. If your flash lights are out, you're going to go looking for a problem. Your tail light, if this fuse blows, it's going to make these go dark too, and that way you got a problem instead of driving around with no tail lights. You didn't know it, because it won't be just by eye. You know what I'm saying? If your tail lights are out. Now this is a little more complicated by the time you get in these 2000s model Wranglers. I worked on one of these over at the Ford place. We have the Jeep franchise over there. Back after I worked here, but sometimes on Friday afternoons for professional development, I'd go over and I'd just help them figure one out. This one right here, this stupid cluster wouldn't work. All right, and this right here, I actually simplified this schematic. If you go to the Chrysler Shop Manual, you're going to flip through 7 pages to figure all this out, because it goes from page to page to page to page to page. Well, I actually put all this together on one thing. And this is basically how it's wired up. The switch turns on that fuse, and that goes to the multifunction switch, and then that goes here, and this little multifunction switch down here, well, where it's basically where you got your, dimmer, actually sends a signal to this board in here, and that board in there is what decides what these lamps are doing. Well, the problem with that is that the lamps wouldn't work. There was nothing wrong with any of this, but this part right here had gone south, and it wouldn't operate these lamps. That's $600 for a cluster, unless you want to bypass this darn thing and go right to them lights. So go figure that out for a little bit. All right. What happened? Did we die?
Oops.
Let's see if we got there. Okay, I actually went the wrong way. Navigate Explorer, like a road map of Clarksburg. This one right here has got 2 separate wires coming off of it, going to different parts of the cluster. So I used to get an Explorer in every now and then that these lights would work, but the radio lights and stuff wouldn't. And this sucker right here would go bad and cause that kind of thing. I wonder what happened there. About these transistors, back in the mid 70s, and a little bit later than that, I'm sure. These things right here, they had one of these little transistors, a little power transistor, and it was basically like a field effect transistor that whenever you increase the amount coming in on the base, it would let more juice go across there to fire your lights up. These little suckers were on a heat sink because they would get hot because there was resistance there when they weren't letting all the stuff go through, and they would burn out. And they were aggravating to get to replace, but that was something right there you used to see. Now, a lot of instrument systems are out there when they give trouble before your yardstick leak. It's not wise to wing it. You got to know how the one you're working on is wired. If you don't know how it's wired up, you're probably going to make a mess. Or you may bust off your oil pressure sending unit and then drill a hole out too big when you're trying to fix it and ruin the head. All right, question 1. The instrument cluster is traditionally this is illumination. Parallel, series, series parallel, or Darlington.
Darlington sound right.
Yeah, that sounds like a race car, doesn't it? But that ain't what I'm talking about. All right, you got 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Next one. Technician A says each instrument panel gauge or indicator is driven by a dedicated switch or sensor. B says the positive side of a non-energized illumination lamp circuit will show a grounded check with a test light. So I've got the one that's not, like if you energize this light, it lights up all the little lights. If you check it with a test light hooked to hot, you go there, what are you gonna read?
Ground.
You're gonna read ground. Who's right about that? Is that guy right? Go for it. Technician A says vacuum fluorescent displays and liquid crystal displays work the same way. Technician B says all digital speedometers are sensor driven rather than cable driven, and all analog or needle driven speedometers are cable driven. To determine the full extent and the role a particular electronic component plays in a particular vehicle system, the best place to try is where? You wanna buy a vowel? Technician A says the instrument panel dimming on the O3 regulator is handled by a rheostat and combination switch. Technician B says the EMIC produces a variable pulse width voltage feed directly to all the VFD displays in the vehicle. That's kind of a crazily worded question, isn't it? A says one good way to check a switch is bypass it and see if the circuit works. Is that the Charles way?
Yep.
B says checking a load carrying switch with an ohmmeter is not always a reliable test. We gotta hurry. It's almost time to go to lunch. Fuse has been checked with a test light or voltmeter and found to have power on both sides, but the protected circuit is still not powered up, and there are no connectors on the circuit between the fuse panel and the load. Which of the following would be a good next step? A says the voltage drop of 0.5 volts or less is acceptable on the positive side of the circuit. B says the voltage drop of 0.4 volts or less is acceptable on the ground side of the circuit. Who's right about that? By the way, I will be giving verbal exams. I may pop up in the shop and just ask you a hard question today. Ever do that, Kevin? Yeah, she's not even listening, is she? Go to sleep? You dozing off? A says an automotive electrical circuit that pulls 10 amps loaded should be protected with a 10 amp fuse. Really? Technician B says the filament on a 3157 automotive bulb has more resistance when the bulb is illuminated than when the bulb is not illuminated. Alright, technician A says a real technician doesn't need a wiring schematic to diagnose an electrical concern. Technician B says a test light is better than a voltmeter when checking components and connections on load-bearing circuits. Alright. Alright, what we got here? Alright, cluster illumination circuit is typically what?
Parallel.
Series parallel.
Oh.
That's it, you crashed the board? Huh? Amazing! You were listening, weren't you? That's
I
outstanding.
know it's parallel, but
Kayla's usually turning into a skeleton when we get into work. Alright. Alright, instrument panel gauge is driven by a dedicated switch or sensor typically, right? Typically, sometimes they come off the network, but usually it's driven by that. B says the positive side of a non-energized illumination lamp circuit will show ground. Now this is how people foul up and think that's the ground for the darn radio. And they hook it up to the radio ground wire and they blow the fuse on your, as soon as they turn on the, everything, they pop the fuse because they measured up right. I mean, make sure you know which wire does what and, when you're checking for ground. So this one right here, yeah, this guy is right, and you look at both, put a C on that, both of them. A says the vacuum fluorescent displays and liquid crystal displays work the same way. They do not, there are different ways they work. Technician B says all digital speedometers are sensor driven. Anytime you see all or always or never, that's a red flag. So basically that, yeah, both those guys are neither. Both those guys are buffoons. All right, the full extent of the role of particular electronic component plays, where do you go?
Owner's manual.
Description and operation page. You don't go to the owner's manual, what are you telling? You get in the glove box on somebody's car for what? What's up with
Yeah.
that? You don't find about anything in there. Sometimes there'll be a bunch of field mouse been living in there, and then you go in there and find all that. All right. A says the instrument panel is dimming on a 03 Wrangler, showing about a rheostat. That's not a rheostat, it's basically a little potentiometer. And B says the EMIC produces a variable pulse width voltage, and that's right, but that's wrong. So that's basically gonna be a B only. That's a B only. And A says one good way to check a switch is bypass it. That's a good way to do it. B says checking a load carrying switch with a ohmmeter is not always a reliable test. If you got an ohmmeter, I can grind a battery cable where there's just one wire left in the battery cable, and the ohmmeter will say it's good. Well, will it start the car? You better hook up. If you got a ground that needs to pull a load, and I've got a video on there that I can show y'all demonstrating this, you better use a headlight bulb. Because if that ground won't burn a headlight bulb, it's probably not gonna pull a load. Headlight bulb pulls how many amps? About
You said it was like 4. Right?
5, 4, 6, something like that. And so if it'll pull 5 or 6 amps, and I light that bulb real bright, you got a pretty good chance that's a good ground. You may check it with a test light. How much does a test light bulb pull?
2.
It barely even, it pulls about a half an amp, usually at the best, you know, but it will at least tell you most of the time. But I have actually seen a situation where it would burn a test light bulb on that Ranger out there. The Ranger wouldn't start one time, it would burn a test light bulb when I turned it on, but it would not run the fuel pump. And so I hooked a headlight bulb up to it, and it would not burn a headlight bulb, but it would burn a test light bulb. So just because you got power there that'll burn a test light bulb doesn't mean you have enough. So we had a ground problem, we had voltage drop on the ground side on that. Huh?
Both.
On that one right there. This one right here is good. A is right, B is right. Both of these guys are right. A fuse has been checked with a test light or voltmeter, and it's found that I've run into this on both sides, but the protected circuit is still not powered up, and there are no connectors in the circuit between. I'm gonna look at the fuse site and see if it's got a spread or damaged female terminal. This was more prevalent when people used to hook up like cell phones and a lot of accessories on their car, and they try to put one of them little things in there on the fuse to shove it in there and get it, and if it spreads those terminals out, what you got is you got this. And when you're using a meter to check a terminal or something, or a test light to check any kind of a terminal on a relay socket, don't ram it down in there and spread the terminals apart. It won't never work again. You can just ruin one like that. On some of the older Fords that had the split round terminals, I would take the little thing out when we had a crazy problem with some of those Fords, and I would pinch every one of those terminals a little bit, make sure it was good and tight on its little terminal, and if I'd fix problems like that a lot of times that nobody else could figure out. And it didn't cost anything to do it, you know, at the time. A says positive voltage drop of half volt, is that right? Half volt on the positive side? Voltage drop, that's good. 4/10 of a volt on the negative side, is that good? That is bad. It's supposed to be no more than 1/10 of a volt on the negative side. No, we don't second rate amateur and answer that question wrong now. Who missed that question?
Not me, because we did that on electric.
Bingo, there you go. All right, so who's right about that? Technician A is right, technician B is wrong. All right, 9, A says automotive electrical circuit that pulls 10 amps loaded should be protected with a 10 amp fuse. True or false? What should you put in there?
About
If it pulls 10 amps loaded,
15.
and you put a 15 because it's gonna spike up above 10 amps and then drop back down. So if you put a 10 amp fuse on one that's pulling 10 amps loaded, it's gonna pop that fuse even if there's nothing wrong. B says the filament on a 3157 automotive bulb has more resistance when the bulb is illuminated than when the bulb is not illuminated. He is true. When it's illuminated, it's positive temperature coefficient, so it's gonna have more resistance than whenever it's not burning. You guys have a funky little plug-in glass bulb you got nowadays. Well, actually, you'll find one that's not working, but when you pull the bulb out, you see nothing wrong with the bulb, but when you change the bulb, it works.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's because that little round wire is just barely touching, you know, this terminal. And there's almost nothing there. You know, sometimes you can clean those lights off with a pencil eraser and put them back in, they'll work, you know, because you won't have any burned out filaments in them a lot of the time. Sorry, it didn't go. Real technician doesn't need a wiring schematic, is that true?
Wrong.
I worked on cars without wiring schematics for 6 years. And when I first saw a wiring schematic at the Volkswagen place, I said, hey, this is amazing. I can fix cars now without having to guess. All right. Technician B says the test light is better than a voltmeter when checking components. And, you know, you basically need something that's gonna pull a load that's equal to the circuit you're checking, right? So if you're checking a circuit that's gonna pull 6, 7 amps, like that fuel pump I was talking about, you better doggone sure check it with a headlight bulb or something that will pull a constant, you know,